Hi, I'm Kerry and I'm a physiotherapist and sports injury researcher from the University of Sydney. I'm also a strength and conditioning coach and I have a PhD in behavioural science. And I'm really pleased to be invited to present at the 2020 Australian Coaching Conference. Together with my co-presenters, we're going to talk to you about heading, which is a subject that is very close to our hearts. So before I give you an overview of today's presentation, I'd like to give you further insight into my background. So I graduated as a physiotherapist 23 years ago, and one of my first roles was to work with the former England and British Olympic team physiotherapist who ran a clinic which really specialised in neck rehabilitation, particularly sports-related neck injuries. And so we worked with a number of elite and non-elite athletes involved with rugby union, equestrian and Formula One. It wasn't until I moved to Australia and had children of my own that I really started to think about heading the ball. So watching my young son as an 8-year-old head the ball in training, it really started to think whether heading was safe and whether the players were really conditioned to cope with the forces of the ball on head impact. So today what we are going to talk to you about is the science of heading. So looking at who heads the ball and in which game situations, then talking about the biomechanics of heading. We'll also look at the heading guidelines as they exist around the world, and then we'll translate this into coaching. So I'll particularly draw on the experience of Dean to really give you some tips that you can take home to use with your players and your teams. So to give you a very quick overview of the research that my team and I are conducting here in Australia, I thought I'd play this short 90-second video, which will just really give you a very quick an overview of what we're currently doing here in Australia. The other thing that I would like to emphasise is that over the last 18 months, we have completed a number of different studies here in Australia. So a lot of the data that I will talk about will be data that has been collected overseas by other researchers, but also data that we have collected using players that you're probably familiar with. They may be players that you coach, or they may be players that your teams play against. So we have had 2 papers already published related to heading. We've submitted another 2 that have been accepted for publication. We have another 2 that are under review, and I'm just about to submit another study about neck strength. So the first study that we looked at was really to have an understanding of who heads the ball and when do they head the ball. So a lot of the heading guidelines are really focused on young players. So it's really important that we have an understanding of whether players head the ball regularly and at what age do they start to head the ball. So this was the first study that we conducted. So we looked at a boys team and we followed them over 3 seasons, from under 10 to under 11 and under 12. And what we found is that at under 10s, 87% of players headed the ball at least once. So some players didn't head the ball at all during all of the home matches that we analysed. By the time you got to under 11 and under 12 age groups, every single player within the team was heading the ball at least once. So the range of headers per player per match was about 0 to 2. Now this doesn't sound like very many, and certainly a lot of the research that's been conducted in Europe and the US does illustrate that heading in boys or young football is actually quite low in frequency. However, the point I really want to emphasise is that the range of headers, depending on the individual player and the position that they play, is a really wide variation. So at the end of the 3 seasons, the players that headed the ball more often headed the ball 6 to 7 times more than the players who were observed to not head the ball very often. And if we extrapolate that over a course of a playing career, it could make the difference between players who head the ball several hundred times versus a couple of thousand times. What we also saw is that under 10 age group, most of the balls were headed from a throw-in. Under 11 and under 12, most of the balls were headed from free play. And we saw very few headers from corner kicks, which is not surprising because of a number of the players doing short corners, or by the time the ball reached the box, it was below head height. So we then wanted to move up an age group, so we then looked at heading incidents in NPL matches, so under 13s to under 17s in females, and under 13 to under 18s in males. And so we used the same coding methodology that we had in the boys' football, that every time we saw a head impact, we coded it, whether it was purposefully headed or whether this was a non-intentional head impact, either due to head-to-head clashes, elbow to head, shoulder to head. So we coded over 4,600 head impacts. 99% of those were players who purposefully headed the ball. We coded very few head impacts from players who had either been hit with the ball unintentionally or had been impacted through head-to-head clashes or shoulder-to-head. And very few of those required medical attention in terms of the physio or the trainer coming on to attend to that player. Heading duels increased significantly with age, so we saw very few in the younger age groups, but much more in the older age groups. Just like the under 11s and under 12s, most headers were from free play, with a few still from throw-ins, and corner kicks were increasing with age. So the other thing that I'd like to emphasise here is that when you look at raw numbers of headers, the number of headers increases with age, but not when you take into account match time. When you take into account match time, we actually saw more headers in the under 15 age groups and the under 17 females than we did at under 18 males. We also found that most headers occurred in the middle third of the pitch, and that the defenders tended to have the most headers. So they headed the ball in defence, they headed the ball in midfield, and they headed the ball in attack. The attackers actually headed the ball the least, taking out the goalkeepers. And most headers occurred from long-range balls. We also saw that most headers had the point of contact on the player's forehead, which is a good sign, but there was still a high number of headers that had the point of contact on the top of the head and the side of the head, which are more closely linked to injury risk than the forehead. So fortunately, 2 of our authors on these 2 papers were also authors on the UEFA heading study, which was published earlier this year. So we were able to use the same coding methodology and able to convert our raw heading data into incident rates. So this is headers per 1,000 match hours. So this allows the comparison of the data between the data we collected with Australians and the data that was collected across 8 European teams. So the age groups where we had comparable data was at the under 16 level. And so what we found was the under 16 males headed the ball less than all 8 European teams. So the highest incident rate was with the English teams, and they headed the ball 3 times greater than the Australian under 16 males. What was really interesting was that the under 16 females actually headed the ball the 3rd highest compared to the European teams. And the difference between the incident rate of headers between males and females in Australia was only 7%. So the Australian females headed the ball at a very similar rate to the males. Whereas the difference between England was 56%, and England tend to head the ball much more than any other European team. So is heading safe? Well, this was the question that really started me on my research journey. So one of the things I'd like to emphasise is that there is no evidence at the moment to demonstrate that there is a causal link between heading and poor brain health in later life. However, there is a number of observational studies that suggest that this may be the case. So this is really where my team of researchers are focused on, is that if we wait to really establish whether there is a causal link or whether there isn't a causal link, this may take many years or decades, because to conduct this research we would really need to follow players over a number of years or even decades, count the number of headers that they do, also account for other confounders for neurodegenerative disease such as a family history, rate of concussion, whether they smoke, whether they drink. And so really, as an insurance policy to our young players, we really should establish strategies that can make heading safer in the short term. So most purposeful headers are of low impact, so much lower than the threshold for a concussion. And the concussion threshold has been developed from studies in boxing. And so it's not that heading can cause concussion, because there's been very few reported incidents of heading which is directly related to a purposeful header. Most of the concussion rates have come from heading duels, head-to-head contact, ball-to-head contact when the player's not expecting it. So really what we're focused on is purposeful headers where the player is expecting to head the ball, so quite different from concussion. And that's what we don't understand, is the cumulative effect of headers. So despite not having a causal link, a number of football associations around the world have developed heading guidelines. So the first was US Soccer. So US Soccer had a class action lawsuit that was brought against them by players and by parents. And they weren't seeking any monetary award. What they wanted to do was have a review of all of the heading parameters and whether a ban or a restriction could be put in place. So because of this class action lawsuit, heading was banned in the under 10s. And then heading restrictions were put in place for the under 11 to under 13s, with no restrictions from the under 14 age groups upwards. In February of this year, the football associations of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland also updated their heading guidelines. So they have no heading practice for the under 11s, with restricted heading from under 12s up to under 18. What concerns me about the heading guidelines is that there is no mention of heading restriction in games. And so from the research that we have conducted and research that's been conducted around the world, we do know that players under the age of 11 do start to head the ball, particularly some players in key positions. And so if players are prohibited from heading the ball in training, we're potentially increasing their injury risk, because their first exposure to heading may be with a high pressure match ball in a match situation, which we know is much more closely related to injury risk than in a controlled environment with their coach. And again, we know from our research that by the time they get to 11 and 12, some players will have headed the ball a substantial amount of time. In May of this year, UEFA released their heading guidelines, and I was part of an expert panel who provided some of the evidence as they were drafting their guidelines. And these are much more pragmatic. They talk about ball characteristics. They also talk about neck exercises and some of the things that we'll further discuss today. What they don't do is restrict heading practice. I don't know what FIFA's position is, and currently the FFA, my understanding is they don't have any heading guidelines. So what happens during heading? So this picture might be familiar to you. So this is Newton's cradle. So Newton's cradle is a really good example of the conservation of momentum and energy. So when you lift the ball in Newton's cradle, it transfers all of its energy through the balls, and then the ball on the far side will move. Now those balls will continue to move indefinitely unless they lose energy. And they do tend to lose energy over time through air resistance. So how does this translate to heading? So I'd just like to play you this short video. If we imagine the white ball is the football and the red ball is the player's head. As the white ball impacts against the player's head, you'll see the ball deform, and then you'll see all of that energy transfer into the red ball. So the white ball becomes stationary because it no longer has momentum because it has been transferred. If we now see this as an example with a ball in the player's head, that ball again becomes stationary as it's lost all of its momentum and energy into the player. So when we're talking about making heading safer, what we're trying to do is reduce the amount of energy that is transferred from the ball into the player. So we know from other evidence that the injury risk is much more closely associated with head acceleration than the force of the ball. So the more the head moves and the more violently it moves, the more likely you are to get movement with the brain. And if it is a very violent movement where the head really is moving a lot in relation to the trunk, you can get impact of the brain against the skull. So what we need to do is to put strategies in place that reduce head acceleration, and it is possible to get zero head acceleration in relation to the trunk by good technique. So before we move on to coaching and certainly draw on the experience of Dean and Andrew, that what I'd just like to give you a very quick overview is the influences in making heading safer. So the first point is the primary influencer, whether we're talking about an unintentional head impact or whether we're talking about purposeful heading. So unintentional head impacts which have led to concussion through elbow or head-to-head contact, there has been a 29% decrease in concussion across the elite level just by having a rule change which penalises player for deliberate elbow to head contacts. So that's one important aspect, and then we want to look at the other end of what can we do from a coaching perspective. The secondary influences are the ball. So it is important to use an age-appropriate ball because they do differ in size. However, the ball regulations are stipulated by the International Football Association board, and the ball pressure, whether it's a size 3, size 4 or size 5 ball, is exactly the same. So roughly 8 to 16 psi. And so there is a big difference by using balls at the lower end of that pressure and balls at the higher end of that pressure. The construction of the ball also makes a difference. So when we think about the video with the red ball and the white ball, you see the ball deform on impact. That's actually a really important process. If a ball is overinflated and doesn't deform either through construction or because it's overinflated, the actual point of contact will be on a much shorter time frame, which is more likely to produce much quicker head accelerations than if some of the energy is dissipated by ball deformation. Speed of the ball, we know balls delivered from a throw-in tend to be much lower than those delivered by a kicked ball. Trajectory also makes a difference depending on whether it's an upward ball as opposed to a downward ball because of air resistance. We'll also talk to you about biomechanics and increasing the effective mass of the player and technique, that whether a player is experienced or has been taught to head the ball or whether the player is actually quite fearful of heading the ball. So we've come up with a 5-point heading plan, which is really designed to look at all the aspects that we can implement to make heading safer in the short term. So exposure, what this means is that I'm a strong believer that players should be taught how to head the ball, but that doesn't mean you do lots and lots of training or that you do a heading drill in every single practice session. It's about being judicious in when you introduce heading and at what age groups. So heading can start without a ball. We can also start with a lightweight ball or a low pressure ball. But it's also important that you restrict the heading drills to those that replicate a match situation and take out things like juggling with the head or head tennis, which don't replicate the sorts of things that young players will have to do in training. And being very mindful of understanding that some players head the ball much more frequently than others in matches. So if they've been seen to head the ball a lot in a weekend game, maybe they don't head in training at all, just to give them a rest from heading. Equipment. So Andrew will talk to you much more about the Heading Pro ball. What is important to recognise is that the mass and the pressure of the ball can make a big difference to head acceleration. And studies that have been conducted in Europe, but also looking at head form models and mathematical equations, have found that actually reducing the ball pressure to the lower end of the IFAB match regulations can reduce head acceleration by as much as 50%. So it's being cognizant when you're blowing up a ball. Are you just blowing it up until it's a squeeze test, or are you actually looking with a pressure gauge as to what the pressure of the ball is actually registering? So this slide probably needs a fair bit of explaining. So to understand this study that we conducted very recently is that we went to an NPL club and we had a cross-section of players from under 13 to under 16 males and under 17 females. And what we got them to do was to wear a swim cap with an accelerometer on the back of the head, and then we had a pro licensed coach who delivered the ball to them using a throw-in. So they were delivered 3 throw-ins per ball, and they had 4 different balls. So what the trace in the figure will show you is the 3 throw-ins per ball. So you can see that the force in G varies depending on which ball was delivered to the player. So ball 1 was a super light size 5 ball. And so this isn't a ball that you could really play football with, but it's a ball that you possibly could use with young players to introduce them to the technique of heading. And so we found, compared to the ball number 4, which is a match regulated ball that was at 10.5 psi, it was a size 5 ball, that using ball 1 reduced head acceleration between 57 and 59%, so almost 60%. Ball number 2 was also a size 5 ball that was exactly the same weight as the match ball, but it actually had a pressure that was only 5 psi's. And we found that this reduced linear acceleration and angular velocity between 26 and 41%. Ball number 3 is the heading pro ball. So this is a ball that's specifically been developed and designed for heading. And compared to the number 4, the match ball, this reduced head acceleration by almost 50%. And what I mean by linear acceleration and angular velocity, these are the different movements of the head. So linear is forwards and backwards, side to side, up and down. Angular velocity is the rotation around those axes, so nodding side to side, turning the head. And both are really important for reducing injury risk. So I'd now like to welcome Andrew to come and talk to us about the heading pro ball.
Thank you, Kerry. Very much appreciate being here at the 2020 Football New South Wales Coaching Conference. Fantastic research. It's exceptional, and it's going to do a lot for the game. Will do and has done and continue going forward. When Dean came to see me about producing a football specifically for heading, he went into all his concerns about his experience at the professional level, on just how many times they need to practice heading a football, but also to the fact that growing up, there wasn't a level of education surrounding how you need to head the ball. This is where we started to come up with the Heading Pro. How do we get a ball into the market that's going to help players and kids learn, not be in fear of the ball, but learn technique and do it in an efficient way, so when they get to heading a ball in normal play, they do it without fear and they do it with the right technique, which will in turn reduce the impact it will have on any injury. Now, that was our key goal. The objectives behind the ball itself was to produce a soft, light, balanced football that had the characteristics to be consistent with a real ball, with a normal, everyday match ball that you see on the pitches. It needed to be in line with that and to create the environment, whether you're crossing, how it's coming off your foot, you're crossing, you're heading, it needed to be consistent. And that was where it started. We went around about and we did plenty of testing on different construction, different materials, the backing layers, the outer layer, where we needed responsive cushion in there. We needed to have the balance and the weight ratio in a light that made it playable, but it also did its job and made it easy for the kids and players to head and reduce the impact. We did this for 2 years, back and forth, and we had Dean testing in the field with kids himself and his somewhat decent left foot, I will say, and throughout testing at the factories and within our own means. To be able to come up with this, we were then introduced to Dr. Kerry Peake, who, as you hear before me, is just her exceptional knowledge and research will make a huge difference to the game. When put to the test, we found through the research that the size, the cushion, and the reduction of head acceleration and impact was up to 50% from a normal football. Once we were given the actual statistics and the data surrounding that, it was, yes, we've got there. And we're only going to improve. But it was a great start and a great completion to a two-year journey for Dean and myself to come up with a ball that's going to actually impact and help the game development. And that's what it was all about. It's all about development. It's all about education. As a manufacturer, we are here to support governing bodies, researchers, players, coaches, and put the right tools into the game. Better consistency, better technology, better construction. We just need to be better. That's our role. And heading pro in this space, we believe, is a great start to help development and get some education into the heading market. That about wraps it up for me. I feel very privileged to be standing here at a coaching convention like this. I hope you all share the same, not just interest, but concern and keenness to help develop the game. I thank Football New South Wales, Dr. Kerry Peake, Dean, and all the speakers here and the audience for having me. Heading Pro will be available for purchase and pre-order. Heading Pro will be available for purchase shortly. For delivery January 21. We'll kick off the pre-orders. If you have any information, please get in touch with us. Dean will follow up with the information later of how to contact us. But thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Kerry, for having me here. I'm very privileged and grateful to be a part of the Australian National Coaching Conference for 2020. My name's Dean Heffernan. I'm the current W League coach for the Western Sydney Wanderers. I was lucky enough to have a 15-year career as a professional footballer. In that time, also lucky enough not to suffer any concussions, but for me, it actually happened 2 years after retirement in a charity match where I first had to understand what it was like to be concussed and the recovery phase and everything that went with the symptoms of concussion. So after my recovery, and I think the studies from Kerry speak for themselves, the risk, the accumulation of small impacts, it started to really get me thinking about the safety of heading in football, especially for the development of young kids from the age of 9 to 12. As Kerry mentioned, the precedence or the incidence of headers, should I say, as they get older in the game and the preparation that they might have to build towards that. So for us, when we designed this lightweight ball that Andrew spoke about earlier, we thought we needed to develop a series of educational videos for coaches, parents, and people alike who are with these kids during the week to help prepare them for what's to come on the weekend. So before we get going with any research, any educational videos, we need to really look at the common mistakes when people try and head a football. Now, you go to any field on a Saturday or Sunday and you'll see some of these mistakes I'm about to read out to you. So, eyes closed. shoulders up, arms down by their side, not actually out to protect themselves and provide balance. The neck and core may not be really braced for the impact that's about to come. The primary contact with the ball might be at the back of the head or the top of the head rather than being on the forehead. The mouth will be wide open a lot of the time, which is susceptible to concussion also with impacts to the jaw from other players, as Kerry mentioned. And not being balanced and ready to head the ball and able to assess the flight. So when we look at all those factors when it comes to heading a football, we've obviously found that all of these increase the risk of injury. So what can we do about it? This is when we came up with obviously the lightweight ball, because we know that by cancelling heading out of the game altogether would only create fear and it wouldn't be effective because it's not going to happen worldwide. Eventually, players are going to have to head the football and they need to be prepared, comfortable, and more than anything, confident to be able to meet the ball with the forehead during a game of football. So let's get players prepared for that earlier. We have a lightweight football. We have the studies from Kerry around activating the core and neck muscles, which you'll hear more about later, and then some educational videos that we have here. The first video I'm going to show is seated heading. Now this strips the technique of heading all the way back, so it's just an action of the trunk, backwards, forwards, timing, looking through the ball and getting used to that impact on the forehead. As you can see, each of the videos have coaching points of what I just mentioned, and I guess the main ones here are the assessing the flight of the ball, the timing, and having your arms there for protection as well. I believe that with the lightweight ball, you can focus on this area of the game in terms of heading, maybe 15 minutes or so per week. It doesn't mean just because it's a lightweight ball that you can do an hour's worth of heading for that session. You still got to have a bit of common sense when you go and use the ball and when you want to try and practice these techniques and the age groups you're working with also. The progression for this would be to lift your feet up, and that obviously puts a lot more strain on the abdominal area and the neck area. And then we've got the heading probe 3As, assess the flight of the ball, arms out for balance, power, protection. And one of the key ones, as I said, you'll hear about later on in the presentation, is attack the ball with a strong neck and core. On the next one, as I said, there's a series of educational videos on our website. I've just chosen 2 for today. So obviously that's the level 1 introductory seated heading. This one is for jumping. This is probably number 6 in our series. So again, you can see here, there's a lot happening when a player wants to head the ball here. So for us and for players to be able to jump, use their arms, assess the flight of the ball and make contact with the correct part of the head, there's a lot of things happening. So by stripping it all the way back to a level that players can understand and learn to practice is an easy way to be able to get through to the players in terms of confidence, technique and jumping when heading a ball. Again, we've got our key coaching points, assessing the flight of the ball, now having your feet shoulder width apart, ready to jump, arms out for power, balance, protection, and being able to meet the ball using your trunk, strong neck, and obviously, as we said before, all those things that increase the risk of injury have been cancelled out by having these particular techniques and coaching points. And then again, we have an easy progression, ball in the air now, being thrown, having to come and meet it, having to retreat slightly to step up and head the ball. But again, key for all kinds of heading in football is assessing the flight of the ball also. Again, heading probe 3As, and we can't talk about these enough. Assessing the flight of the ball, obviously there's a lot of factors that fall underneath that category. Moving your feet, adjusting your body to the flight of the ball, where's the opposition coming from to defend against you also. So these are all areas that go into heading a football. Having those arms out for balance, power, protection. When I say power, it's not also just coming to meet the ball with the strong trunk, but it's also power to be able to jump and hang in the air also, which is a key part of the technique of heading. And attacking the ball with a strong neck and core, as we've mentioned. I won't bore you anymore with any coaching. We'll get back to the science that Kerry's worked very hard on. Once again, thank you very much for having us as a part of the Australian Coaching Conference for 2020, and look forward to hearing from anyone that wants information about Heading Pro, that you can contact us on our website, headingpro.com, or if you'd like some information through email, info@headingpro.com. And we also have an Instagram page which contains the series of educational videos @heading_pro. So if you'd like to jump on any of those things to catch up with myself or Andy, feel free to do so. And thanks again for having us.
So technique, this is really Dean's domain. I'm not a coach, and the only thing that I would add here is to say that we really should start to teach players heading technique before they start to head the ball in games. Their first exposure in heading should be in a controlled environment, particularly with a coach that is experienced, that can give them some tips about how to head the ball safely. Otherwise, players are just going to put their head in the way in a match or respond to coaches' feedback. So activation, so this is really my specialist subject, so I'm very keen to share with you the research around neck strengthening and neck activation. So players need to learn how to increase their effective mass via a strong activated neck. So it's not just about strength, although the foundation of strength is required. It's really about being able to recruit those muscles quickly, because heading is a really quick action. So you can have the strongest neck in the world, but if you can't recruit those muscles, in time for ball impact, then it's probably not going to make a big difference. So effective mass means the mass of the player which is able to oppose the force of the ball on impact. And young players and females typically have low effective mass. So to give you a video of what low effective mass might look like, this is the ball coming in. The ball weighs 430 grams, give or take, and your head is approximately 4 to 5 kilograms. If your neck is not connected to your body, then what will happen is you're only opposing the force of the ball with the weight of your head. If we can increase the effective mass of the player, that you'll see in this video, that you're now being able to recruit the trunk muscles, you're able to increase your body weight to get behind that ball. So now it's not just the mass of the head, now it's potentially 20, 40, 80 kilos. So this moves us on to another study that we conducted this year. So again, we conducted an NPL club looking at players between the ages of 12 and 17. And so we divided the male and females into two groups. So one was the control group, they just continued with their usual training, and the other were the intervention group. So what we got the intervention group to do was all players in the club did the FIFA 11 Plus. So they did parts 1 and 3 at the beginning of each training session, and then at the end of the training session, they did part 2. So in the control group, they just did the part 2 as described in the FIFA. Whereas the intervention group added 2 neck exercises. So I'll show you an example of the neck exercise that we did. So this is about recruiting those muscles quickly. So it's about fast activation. So we're asking the player to roll as quickly as they can, use their feet to drive themselves forwards and backwards, but to actually activate their neck and to use their trunk muscles, and so their head doesn't hit the ground. So we did it with them, the head in midline. We also did it with the head to the side and head to the other side. And what we found was when we tested the player's neck strength, we're using handheld dynamometry. We collected it at baseline. Then we had the intervention group do their neck exercises for 5 weeks, and then we tested their neck strength again. So the bar chart that you'll see here is divided for males and females. So we had the males with the green being the baseline test, the red being the post-exercise test or the 5-week test. What we found was that the male players increased their strength by 30%, those players that were in the intervention group. There was a much bigger increase in strength from the female players that were involved in these neck exercises. And that was mainly because they were quite weak to start with, particularly the under 13 age group. And so how did this translate then to head acceleration? So just like the ball property study, we also got them to head a size 5 match ball. We put the swim cap with the accelerometer on, and so we tested their head acceleration from a throw-in at baseline and then at 5 weeks when we had completed the neck intervention. And we found a 17% decrease in both males and females that completed the neck intervention, and all these results are statistically significant. And I'd also like to emphasise is that although I oversaw the project, the data was actually analysed by someone who was blind, blind to which group the players were involved with. The final part of the 5-point heading plan is that we need to continue research. It's really important that we continue to follow players over the course of their career to really see whether the link between heading and long-term neurodegenerative diseases such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease is real, or whether it's not there. There's no evidence to support that. We also, as we start to implement some of the strategies that make heading safer, we also need to make sure that they're being implemented well and that we're evaluating these strategies so that they're doing what we're hoping for them to do. And this is really important, certainly from my perspective, because the reason why I got into research in this space was to make heading safer for my son. He plays football for a team. He's continued to play through all the youth levels. So if I can make football safer and heading safer for my son, then hopefully I can make heading safer for your children as well. So I'm involved with some wonderful researchers here in Australia and also around the world. So we're about to embark on a study looking at heading technique to see how heading technique changes through adolescence and what does an elite heading technique look like. So we want to do this in the laboratory, but we'll also translate this to the field so that we can also look at what's good heading technique in terms of the safety, but does this then translate to performance parameters in terms of the goals that are saved or the goals that are scored. And so it's really important when we do complete research is that we collaborate as far and wide as possible. So it's been really important that talking to football organisations and talking to people such as Peter Hugg at Football New South Wales and Dean Heffernan at Western Sydney Wanderers, also Dave Mitchell, and people that are involved in neuroscience as well as physiotherapists and biomechanists to really get an understanding from a really wide perspective, because I can write as many papers as I like and they can be published. And that's fantastic for my ego. But unless we make a difference at grassroots level and make heading safer for individual players and teams and clubs, then my research has failed. So if anybody is watching this presentation and wants to get in touch with me to either be part of the research or help to understand heading from a coaching perspective, then I really welcome you to get in touch. And the best way to get in touch with me would be through email, or if you just want to follow what we're doing in this space, then you can follow me on Twitter. I thank you very much for your time.